January 17th, 1945. Iwo Jima, Western Pacific. The observation post sat carved into volcanic rock 300 meters above the black sand beaches. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto pressed field glasses against his eyes, his breath forming thin clouds in the cold dawn air. Below, across the churning grey waters, the American fleet stretched to the horizon. Carriers, destroyers, supply ships forming a steel archipelago that seemed to mock the very concept of scarcity. He had been watching them for 6 days now, these Americans, and each morning brought fresh bewilderment. But this morning would be different. This morning, he would witness something that would shatter every assumption his training had burned into his soul. The sound reached him first, a deep, irregular thrumming that spoke of damaged engines and compromised metal. A Hellcat fighter appeared through the morning haze, trailing a ribbon of black smoke, its propeller laboring against the Pacific wind. Yamamoto watched as the wounded aircraft approached the carrier USS Essex, its flight deck a postage stamp of organized chaos nearly 2 kilometers offshore. The plane wobbled, dipped toward the wave tops, then somehow clawed back altitude. Around him, 3 other Japanese officers had gathered at the observation post, drawn by the spectacle of what they assumed would be a death spiral into the sea. They had seen many planes fall in recent weeks, their own and the enemy's. The ocean had become a graveyard of twisted aluminum and shattered dreams. But the Hellcat did not fall. It touched down hard, far too fast, its damaged landing gear screaming against the deck. Yamamoto could see, even at this distance, the flight deck crew rushing toward the aircraft, tiny figures moving with choreographed precision. The plane rolled to a stop near the carrier's island superstructure, smoke still pouring from its engine cowling. The pilot would be extracted, mourned, his aircraft pushed overboard to make room for the next wave of attackers. This was the calculus of war that both sides understood. Planes were expendable, pilots slightly less so, but the mission was everything. Except that was not what happened. Through his field glasses, Yamamoto watched as flight deck crews swarmed the damaged Hellcat. Not to mourn, not to clear the deck, to repair. Within minutes that felt like a violation of natural law, panels were being removed, tools were moving in organized blur, and the black smoke had ceased. A fuel truck appeared. Ordnance crews rolled forward with bombs and ammunition belts. The pilot, whom Yamamoto could now see as a small figure in a flight suit, never left his cockpit. He was given water, perhaps food, while mechanics worked beneath and around his aircraft with the casual efficiency of factory workers on a production line. 22 minutes after landing, the Hellcat's engine roared back to life. 25 minutes after that, it was catapulted back into the sky, its wings heavy with fresh ordnance, climbing toward the Japanese positions that Yamamoto and his fellow officers occupied. The lieutenant commander lowered his field glasses slowly, his hands trembling, not from cold, but from the complete erosion of everything he thought he understood about war, about America, about the inevitable triumph of Japanese spirit over material excess. "They fixed it," Captain Hideaki Sato whispered beside him, his voice carrying the hollow quality of a man watching his religion collapse in real time. "They fixed it and sent him back." "Mottainai," another officer murmured, the Japanese expression for wastefulness, for the sin of squandering resources. But his tone carried no conviction, only confusion. Because there had been no waste. There had been abundance so profound it rendered the concept of conservation meaningless. To understand the paralysis that gripped these Japanese officers, one must step backward through the fog of ideology and into the material reality that had shaped their entire military philosophy. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the Pacific War as perhaps the most spiritually refined fighting force in human history. A military culture that had elevated scarcity into sacredness, had transformed insufficiency into a perverse form of moral superiority. Their pilots were samurai reborn in flight suits, trained to view death not as failure but as transcendence, to see their aircraft not as machines but as extensions of their honored ancestors' swords. This was not metaphor. This was doctrine. Japanese pilot training in 1941 had been the most rigorous in the world, requiring 3 to 4 years of relentless filtering. Of every 1,000 candidates, perhaps 30 would earn their wings. They learned to fly with an intimacy that bordered on spiritual communion, to coax performance from their zeros through touch and instinct rather than instrument readings. They memorized engine sounds, could diagnose mechanical problems by the vibration through their seat, and were taught to regard their aircraft as sacred trusts that must be preserved, maintained, nursed through damage that American pilots would consider catastrophic. Because in Japan, there would be no replacement. The Zero fighter itself embodied this philosophy, a masterpiece of doing more with less. It achieved extraordinary range and maneuverability by eliminating everything not absolutely essential. Armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, redundant systems. A Zero weighed 1,680 kilograms empty. An American Hellcat weighed 4,190 kilograms. The Japanese had built a katana that could slice through air itself. The Americans had built a flying tank that could absorb punishment and come back for more. In early 1942, when Japanese pilots dominated Pacific skies, their philosophy seemed vindicated. At Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines, across the Dutch East Indies, Zero pilots demonstrated what spirit and skill could achieve. They had been raised on stories of the 47 Ronin, of kamikaze divine winds that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion, of victory through purity of purpose. American pilots, they were told, were soft, individualistic, corrupted by material comfort and democratic chaos. They would break when confronted by warriors who had transcended fear of death. And for a time, it appeared true. But by January 1945, as Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto stood on that volcanic ridge above Iwo Jima, the catastrophic flaw in this beautiful philosophy had become undeniable. Japanese naval aviation had been systematically destroyed, not through lack of courage they possessed in suicidal abundance, but through arithmetic horror their culture had no framework to process. They had entered the war with perhaps 3,500 truly elite pilots. By 1945, fewer than 100 remained. Each loss was irreplaceable. Each damaged aircraft potentially unrecoverable. Each mechanical failure a small apocalypse. The Americans had entered the war with perhaps 4,000 naval aviators. By January 1945, they had more than 60,000. And they were fixing damaged planes on carrier decks in the middle of battles. Yamamoto had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima in 1935, where he had absorbed teachings that traced their lineage back through centuries of samurai tradition. He had been taught that the Western powers were wealthy but decadent, that their material abundance bred moral weakness, that Japanese pilots possessed an inherent spiritual superiority that no amount of enemy resources could overcome. His instructors spoke reverently of the Russo-Japanese War, when Japanese forces had defeated a technologically superior European power through superior morale and willingness to sacrifice. What they had not taught him was logistics. What they had not taught him was that industrial capacity, properly mobilized, could become its own form of superiority, not inferior to spirit, but categorically different, operating on principles that rendered traditional martial virtues almost irrelevant. The American military had discovered something that would have horrified Japanese military philosophers: that you could create victory by making individual courage less necessary, by building systems so robust that average pilots in abundant aircraft could systematically destroy elite pilots in scarce ones. This was not the war Yamamoto had been promised. He had imagined Bushido against cowboys, discipline against chaos, the refined sword against the crude shotgun. Instead, he was witnessing something far more disturbing: a different kind of discipline, a mechanical rather than spiritual form of precision, and abundance so overwhelming it had achieved its own form of invincibility. The Americans did not need their pilots to be irreplaceable heroes. They needed them to be competent, consistent, and above all, alive to fly again tomorrow. That Hellcat pilot who had landed damaged, been repaired, and launched again within half an hour. Yamamoto knew with bitter certainty that he was probably not an ace, not even particularly talented. He was simply adequate, supported by a system that could absorb his mistakes, repair his damage, and send him back into battle with the casual confidence of a civilization that had never known genuine scarcity. Japan's greatest aces, men like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who had scored over 80 confirmed kills, or Tetsuzo Iwamoto with more than 200. They had been warriors of genuinely mythic skill. But they were dead now, almost all of them. Irreplaceable lights extinguished one by one. And their deaths had changed nothing, because the Americans just kept coming, kept fixing, kept launching, in numbers that mocked the very concept of individual heroism. Through the morning, Yamamoto and his fellow officers maintained their vigil, and the pattern repeated with mechanical regularity. Aircraft would return to the carriers damaged, battle damage, mechanical failure, pilot error. It seemed to make no difference. Planes that should have been written off, the Japanese maintenance crews would have salvaged for parts, or perhaps attempted to repair over days or weeks, were being restored to combat status in minutes. The carrier decks had become floating factories, and the pace never slowed. At one point, Captain Sato began keeping count. In a 3-hour period, they observed 11 aircraft make emergency landings on the Essex alone. Of those 11, 9 were repaired and relaunched the same day. One was pushed overboard. Yamamoto watched it tumble into the Pacific with a strange feeling of relief, a confirmation that even American abundance had limits. But then a crane appeared, lifting a new aircraft from the hangar deck below, and the relief evaporated into fresh horror. They had spare aircraft, plural, in storage, on a ship. "We were told they were wasteful," Sato said quietly, his field glasses still pressed to his face, "that their abundance made them weak, careless with resources." Yamamoto did not respond immediately. He was remembering a lecture from 1938, a senior officer explaining why Japan would inevitably triumph over the Western powers. "They have factories, yes," the officer had said, "but they lack the spirit to use them properly. They will grow tired. They will negotiate. They cannot match our willingness to sacrifice everything for victory." The officer had been wrong in a way so fundamental it revealed the complete bankruptcy of their pre-war assumptions. The Americans had not grown tired. They had industrialized war itself, had transformed conflict into a production problem that could be solved with sufficient steel, aluminum, and petroleum. And they had all three in quantities that seemed geologically impossible. Reports that reached Iwo Jima spoke of American shipyards launching a new carrier every month, sometimes multiple carriers. Japanese intelligence had initially dismissed these reports as propaganda, because such production rates violated everything they understood about shipbuilding. A carrier was a supremely complex vessel, requiring millions of work hours, specialized materials, precision engineering. Japan's greatest naval yards had required 2 to 3 years to build a fleet carrier. But the reports were true. The Americans had built shipyards the size of cities, had trained women to weld, had created assembly line processes for vessels that Japan regarded as bespoke artifacts. The Essex alone had been built in 20 months. There were 23 more ships of her class either operational or under construction. Each one was a floating city of abundance, supplied by a merchant fleet so vast that Japanese submariners, once the terror of Pacific sea lanes, now described hunting missions as exercises in futility. Sink one transport, 3 more appeared. The symbolic weight of that Hellcat, the one Yamamoto had watched being repaired and relaunched, had taken root in his mind like a stone Buddha, immovable and quietly devastating. In Japanese naval aviation, an aircraft was a warrior's partner, almost his wife, maintained with ritual care and personal devotion. Pilots knew every rivet of their machines, performed their own pre-flight inspections with religious precision, and mourned damaged aircraft as one might mourn wounded family members. American pilots, from what Yamamoto had observed, treated their aircraft like rental cars. This was not an insult in the traditional sense. It was something stranger and more disturbing. The Americans flew with a competence that suggested professional respect, but not spiritual communion. They did not personally maintain their aircraft. They trusted mechanics. They did not mourn damaged planes. They expected replacements. When a Hellcat or Corsair or Avenger was destroyed, the pilot filled out paperwork and was assigned another, often within hours, sometimes with the same tail number, but an entirely different airframe. The system required standardization, identical parts, identical procedures, identical training. A Hellcat pilot transferred from one carrier to another could fly any F-6F in the fleet because they were functionally interchangeable. Maintenance crews could swap engines, wings, entire tail sections between aircraft because everything was built to exact specifications in factories that produced thousands of identical components. Japan had built approximately 10,000 Zero fighters during the entire war. America had built 12,000 Hellcats, a heavier, tougher, more powerful aircraft, in less than 3 years. The American productive capacity was not merely superior, it was categorically different, operating on an industrial logic that Japanese planners had failed to comprehend. And the pilots themselves reflected this difference. By 1945, American naval aviators received approximately 6 months of intensive training before being assigned to combat units. Far less than the 3 to 4 years Japan had once invested, but adequate because the system did not require them to be masters. It required them to be competent, standardized components who could execute doctrine, follow procedures, and trust that if they made mistakes or encountered damage, the system would catch them. There was something almost insectile about this approach, Yamamoto thought, a hive logic that replaced individual excellence with collective competence, and it was destroying them. By midday, the sky over Iwo Jima had become a layered tapestry of violence. American aircraft struck in waves, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters in close support, while Japanese anti-aircraft fire traced desperate patterns through the air. Yamamoto watched planes tumble from the sky, both American and the few remaining Japanese defenders. Each Japanese loss was a small death for the observers, because they knew that plane and that pilot represented irreplaceable assets, months or years of training, metal that could never be replaced. But the American losses were different. When a Hellcat went down, trailing fire into the Pacific, Yamamoto felt almost nothing from the carrier groups. No pause, no moment of collective grief. Within minutes, another plane was launching, and the rhythm continued unbroken. It was as if the Americans had discovered a form of warfare that functioned like a river. Individual drops might be lost, but the flow never ceased. The volume never diminished. A young lieutenant named Koji Nakamura, who had joined the observation post around noon, voiced what they were all thinking. How do you fight this? How do you fight an enemy that doesn't feel losses? They feel them, Yamamoto said quietly, but their system absorbs the feeling, distributes it. By the time grief reaches the admirals, it's been diluted across so many units, so many ships, so many replacement pilots, that it becomes a statistic rather than a tragedy. It was the opposite of Japanese military culture, which concentrated grief, weaponized it, transformed it into rage that fueled the next attack. When a Japanese pilot died, his comrades felt it personally, intimately, and flew the next mission carrying his spirit with them. It should have made them stronger. Instead, it was making them extinct. Because rage, however pure, could not manufacture aircraft. Grief could not train replacement pilots. And spirit, however refined, could not survive a systemic material disadvantage measured in orders of magnitude. The afternoon brought a moment that Yamamoto would remember with particular clarity for the rest of his life, which would not be long, as he would die during the American landing 3 weeks later. A damaged Corsair, its landing gear clearly malfunctioning, approached the carrier Bunker Hill. The plane came in too fast, too high, waved off by the landing signal officer. It climbed away, trailing hydraulic fluid in a fine mist that caught the afternoon sun like blood vapor. Yamamoto expected the plane to ditch in the ocean, a controlled crash near enough to the fleet that rescue vessels could retrieve the pilot. This was the standard procedure when aircraft damage made carrier landing impossible. Even the Americans, with their abundance, would not risk a bad landing that might damage other aircraft or the carrier deck itself. But the Corsair did not ditch. It circled for 40 minutes while something happened aboard the Bunker Hill. Something Yamamoto could not fully observe, but could infer from the patterns of activity on the deck. They were preparing for the damaged landing, clearing unnecessary planes, positioning fire suppression teams, rigging crash barriers. And then the Corsair came in again, this time committing fully to the approach despite its crippled landing gear. It hit the deck hard, the damaged gear collapsing immediately, and slewed sideways in a scream of tortured metal. Sparks fountained across the flight deck. The plane spun nearly 180 degrees before the crash barriers caught it, stopping its momentum with a violence that should have killed the pilot. But he climbed out. Slowly, helped by deck crew, but alive and apparently uninjured beyond what would heal. Within the hour, that same pilot was airborne again in a different Corsair. "They saved him," Lieutenant Nakamura whispered. "They risked the ship, the deck, other aircraft, to save one pilot." And there it was, the thing that most disturbed Yamamoto about American military doctrine. They were simultaneously ruthlessly systematic and incomprehensibly humanitarian. They would send hundreds of planes to bomb Japanese positions with industrial thoroughness, would prosecute the war with mechanical efficiency that killed thousands. But they would also risk millions of dollars in equipment and the safety of an entire carrier to save a single pilot who might simply have ditched and awaited rescue. Japanese military doctrine had no framework for this contradiction. You were either spiritual warriors who valued honor above life, or you were materialistic merchants who valued profit above sacrifice. The Americans seemed to be neither and both, willing to spend staggering amounts of material wealth to preserve individual human lives, but also willing to unleash that preserved human capital in systematic campaigns of destruction. They had industrialized both warfare and mercy, and the combination was more devastating than either would have been alone. As evening approached and the raids tapered off, not from American exhaustion, but from simple schedule, as if war were a job with shifts, Yamamoto found himself studying the American fleet through his field glasses with something approaching philosophical despair. He was observing the visible manifestation of a civilization so fundamentally different from his own that meaningful comparison became almost impossible. Japan had built its military culture on rice, a crop that demanded collective labor, careful water management, communities bound by shared scarcity. Every grain mattered. Waste was sin. The military had absorbed these agricultural values, had transformed them into a doctrine where every bullet, every drop of fuel, every pilot was precious beyond measure. America had built its civilization on wheat and corn, on vast prairies where abundance was the baseline condition, where waste was not sin, but simply inefficiency, to be tolerated during boom times. They had industrialized this abundance, had created systems that assumed surplus, that planned for waste, that built redundancy into every level of operation. And now, those competing philosophies were meeting in mortal combat, and it was not even close. The numbers, when Yamamoto allowed himself to contemplate them, were almost cosmically unfair. American petroleum production in 1945 would exceed 6 million barrels per day, more than all other nations combined. Their steel production approached 90 million tons annually. Their aircraft factories delivered more than 100,000 planes per year at peak production. They had so many trained pilots that some waited months for combat assignments, not because of institutional incompetence, but because there were more pilots than available cockpits. Japan's petroleum production from their occupied territories never exceeded 1.75 million barrels per day, and was now a fraction of that due to American submarine interdiction. Their steel production had peaked at 7 million tons and was collapsing. Their aircraft factories were running out of aluminum, training programs were running out of fuel, and their most experienced pilots were running out of miracles. And yet, the war continued, because Japanese military doctrine had no mechanism for rational surrender, no cultural framework for acknowledging that some material disparities were too vast to overcome through spiritual superiority. They would fight until there was nothing left to fight with. And Yamamoto knew this, and the knowing was its own form of torture. The recurring symbol that would haunt Yamamoto in his final weeks was not the Hellcat or the Corsair, but something smaller and more intimate, the coffee cups. He had observed American pilots through his field glasses, seen them standing on carrier decks between missions, casually holding paper cups of what he assumed was coffee. They would drink, toss the cup overboard, and receive another without thought or ceremony. Paper cups. Disposable. Discarded into the Pacific by the hundreds, by the thousands. A tiny detail that spoke volumes about the civilization producing them. Japan was running out of methyl for aircraft. America was manufacturing single-use containers for stimulants to keep their adequately rested pilots slightly more alert. The coffee itself was significant. Japanese pilots, toward the end, flew on empty stomachs or meager rations, preserving food for the inevitable final battle. American pilots drank coffee between missions, ate hot meals, had ice cream on their carriers. Yes, ice cream. produced by onboard machines that consumed electricity as casually as Japanese forces rationed candlelight. There was a photograph that would reach Yamamoto through intelligence channels, though too late to matter. It showed the interior of an American carrier's ready room. Pilots lounged in padded chairs, sandwiches and coffee at hand, reviewing maps under bright electric lighting. The room looked comfortable, almost civilian. The pilots looked well-fed, rested, bored. Japanese ready rooms, when they still had functional airfields, were Spartan spaces where pilots sat on hard benches, reviewed missions by candlelight or dim bulbs, and contemplated death with aesthetic appreciation. They were warriors preparing for transcendence. The Americans were professionals preparing for work, and the professionals were winning. As the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the Pacific in shades of red that Japanese poets would have considered auspicious for a warrior's death, Yamamoto allowed himself a moment of honest reflection. He thought about his training, his beliefs, the beautiful lies he had been told about Japanese invincibility. He thought about the pilots he had known, genuine heroes now dead, their skill and courage mattering less than they should have in a universe that ran on production schedules and replacement rates. He thought about that first Hellcat, the one that had been repaired in 22 minutes. The pilot had probably been back at Iwo Jima within the hour, had probably dropped ordnance on Japanese positions, might have killed some of Yamamoto's comrades. And then that pilot had returned to his carrier, eaten a hot meal, perhaps written a letter home, slept in a bunk, and prepared to do it again tomorrow. The casualness of American lethality was perhaps its most devastating characteristic. They were not warriors seeking glory. They were not engaged in spiritual combat. They were executing a systematic program of destruction with the emotional investment of factory workers meeting production quotas. And that lack of spiritual intensity, which Japanese doctrine insisted was weakness, had proven to be a form of strength that Bushido had no defense against. You could not shame Americans into surrender by demonstrating your willingness to die. They responded by building systems that reduced your willingness to die to an irrelevant variable in equations about logistics and industrial output. You could not inspire fear through suicidal attacks. They countered with radar networks, fighter screens, anti-aircraft systems so dense that suicide attacks merely became elaborate forms of target practice. The kamikaze program, which Yamamoto knew would intensify in coming months, was the logical conclusion of Japanese military philosophy. A recognition that since material superiority was impossible, they would weaponize the one thing they possessed in abundance: willingness to die. But he suspected with growing certainty that even this would ultimately fail. The Americans would adapt, they would develop countermeasures, they would absorb the losses and continue, because their system was designed to absorb losses, and Japanese spirit was not infinite after all. Night fell across Iwo Jima, but the American fleet remained visible, outlined in lights that Japanese ships would never have dared display. They were not afraid of submarine attack, not here, not with destroyer screens so thick that Japanese submarines called these waters the Electric Sea for all the sonar pulses. The carriers sat illuminated like city blocks, conducting night operations that Japanese naval aviation had never mastered, because fuel was too precious for night training. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto remained at the observation post long after his fellow officers had departed, watching the distant fleet, trying to commit the sight to memory. He knew with certainty that he would die here, that Iwo Jima would be his grave, and the knowing brought a kind of peace. He had been a warrior in a war that had stopped rewarding warriors, a believer in a philosophy that material reality had rendered obsolete. But he could still appreciate the terrible beauty of what he had witnessed. That Hellcat, damaged and repaired and relaunched, had been more than a plane. It had been a message written in aluminum and high-octane fuel, a statement about American civilization that no propaganda could refute. We are so abundant that we can fix what you must discard. We are so wealthy that we can preserve what you must sacrifice. We will outlast you, not because we are braver, but because we have built a system that makes individual bravery less necessary. And the most damning thing, the thought that Yamamoto almost could not bear to acknowledge even to himself. The Americans were not wrong. Their system worked. Their philosophy, however spiritually impoverished it might be from a traditional Japanese perspective, had achieved something that centuries of samurai culture had not. It had made victory probable rather than merely honorable. 3 weeks later, when American Marines landed on Iwo Jima's black sand beaches, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto died leading a small counterattack against advancing infantry. He was killed by machine gun fire, not heroically, not dramatically, but quickly and efficiently, by men who probably never learned his name. His body was eventually buried in a mass grave with 18,000 other Japanese defenders who chose death over surrender, as their culture demanded. But before he died, Yamamoto wrote a letter to his younger brother, a student in Tokyo. The letter would not survive the war. It was lost when American incendiary raids consumed the neighborhood where Yamamoto's family lived. But a friend who read it before it was sent remembered portions, shared them years later, and those fragments preserved something important about what the defenders of Iwo Jima had witnessed in their final days. "We were told that spirit could triumph over material," Yamamoto wrote. "But we were never told what to do when the enemy has both material and a different kind of spirit. Not the spirit of warriors seeking beautiful death, but the spirit of builders who create such abundance that death itself becomes negotiable. I watched a damaged American plane be repaired in less time than it takes to conduct a tea ceremony. This is not weakness. This is a different kind of strength, and we have no counter for it. Tell this to those who might survive. Tell them that we fought bravely, but bravery was not enough, because we were fighting an enemy who had made bravery less necessary. Remember me with honor, but remember also that honor is only valuable if your civilization survives to remember it." The letter contained no bitterness, no call for revenge, no ritual expression of hatred for the enemy. It was simply an observation, clinical and sad, from a man who had seen his worldview collapse and was trying to preserve some useful truth before he followed that worldview into extinction. The image of that Hellcat, landing damaged, being repaired with casual efficiency, launching again within the hour, would become a kind of ghost story among the few Japanese naval officers who survived the war. In POW camps and later in the Broken Peace, they would share the story as a way of explaining the inexplicable, of putting into narrative form the fundamental asymmetry that had destroyed them. The Americans, they would say, had discovered how to make war sustainable. Not glorious, not spiritually transcendent, but sustainable in the way a factory is sustainable. Capable of producing tomorrow what it produced today. Of absorbing losses and mistakes and damage without fundamental disruption. Japanese military culture had been built on the understanding that war was exceptional. That combat required the sacrifice of everything normal. That victory was achieved by transforming men into something more than human. American military culture, at least the industrial logic that supported it, was built on a different premise. That war was a problem to be solved. That the solution involved logistics and production schedules. That victory came not from transcendence but from system optimization. And supporting this system was an economy so vast that it could simultaneously produce war material and maintain civilian abundance. Could build carriers while ordinary Americans bought refrigerators. could devote a fraction of its industrial capacity to destroying Japan, while the rest continued making the paper cups that pilots would casually discard into the Pacific. This was not the enemy Japanese military planners had imagined in 1941. They had imagined soft civilians in a divided democracy, corrupted by easy living and ideological chaos. What they encountered instead was something their framework had no category for: a civilization that had industrialized not just production, but military culture itself, that had created systems allowing ordinary people to achieve extraordinary results through coordination rather than transcendence. In the decades after the war, a curious thing happened to the story of that Hellcat. Among American veterans, it was not particularly remarkable. Just another damaged plane, another routine repair, another pilot doing his job. The carrier crews who had performed such repairs hundreds or thousands of times during the war barely remembered specific instances. It was simply what you did, part of the system, nothing special. But among the few surviving Japanese naval officers, the story took on almost mythological weight. In their memoirs and rare interviews, they would return to it. This image of American abundance so profound it could resurrect the dead. This casual demonstration that their enemy possessed resources in such surplus that nothing was truly lost, that even destruction was temporary, that the whole American system was built on the assumption of second chances. For a culture that had aestheticized the beauty of things that exist only once, cherry blossoms, the perfect moment, the warrior's final charge. The American capacity for repair and repetition and endless second chances was perhaps more disturbing than any specific weapon or tactic. It revealed a philosophical gulf that no amount of courage could bridge. The Hellcat became a symbol, in these retellings, of the terrible truth that Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto had recognized in his final weeks. That Japan had entered a war against an enemy whose advantages were not merely quantitative, but categorical. The Americans had not just built more, they had built a system that made more sustainable, that assumed abundance rather than scarcity, that treated individual losses as acceptable costs in a larger equation that always balanced in their favor. And perhaps most damning, the system worked not despite American democratic capitalism, but because of it. The very characteristics that Japanese militarists had identified as weaknesses: individualism, profit motive, decentralized decision-making, ideological heterogeneity, had proven to be strengths when mobilized at industrial scale. American factories produced so efficiently partly because workers were paid well and motivated by personal advancement. American pilots fought effectively partly because they wanted to survive and go home, which made them invested in mutual protection and systematic tactics. American innovation accelerated partly because competition and profit encouraged rapid iteration. The beautiful lies of fascist military culture, that scarcity built character, that autocracy enabled efficiency, that warriors were superior to merchants, had been tested against industrial reality and found catastrophically wanting. There is a coda to this story, though it happened far from Iwo Jima and years after the damaged Hellcat had landed and launched again. In 1952, Japanese engineers visited American aircraft factories as part of post-war reconstruction programs. They toured assembly lines, observed quality control processes, interviewed production managers. And many of them wept. Not from humiliation, though pride was certainly wounded. They wept from recognition, from seeing the system that had destroyed them and understanding, finally and completely, how thoroughly they had misunderstood the enemy they had chosen to fight. The Americans had not won through material abundance alone. They had won by creating systems that made abundance sustainable, by building organizations that turned average people into effective components, by industrializing not just manufacturing, but continuous improvement itself. One Japanese engineer, watching F-86 Sabres being assembled in a Los Angeles factory, was quoted in a contemporary report. "We thought they were wasteful. We thought abundance made them weak. We did not understand that they had discovered how to make abundance systematic, how to build organizations that assume surplus rather than scarcity. This is not weakness. This is the most powerful force humanity has ever created. We lost the war before it began because we could not imagine this." The engineer's name was Eiji Toyoda. Within a decade, he would help transform Japanese manufacturing by adapting and improving American production systems, creating the Toyota production system that would revolutionize global industry. The lessons learned from defeat, the recognition that systematic abundance could be engineered, that continuous improvement could be institutionalized, that ordinary workers in well-designed systems could achieve extraordinary results, would help build Japan's post-war economic miracle. But that was later. On Iwo Jima in January 1945, there was only the observation post, the watching officers, and the fleet below that represented everything their training had taught them to despise, and everything material reality had proven they should have feared. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto and his fellow observers had witnessed not just American military power, but the visible manifestation of a different civilizational logic, one that would, in various forms, come to dominate the post-war world. The sun set on Iwo Jima. The American fleet continued its operations. Somewhere out there, a pilot who had landed damaged that morning was sleeping in his bunk, probably dreamlessly, probably unremarkably, completely unaware that his survival and return to combat had shattered ideological certainties in the minds of men watching from volcanic ridges. He would fly again tomorrow, and the day after, and perhaps he would survive the war, go home, marry, have children, work an ordinary job, and tell occasional stories about his time in the Pacific that would focus on the fear and boredom rather than the systematic abundance that made his survival possible. Because to him, it was not remarkable. The repair crews, the replacement aircraft, the hot meals and coffee and ice cream, the expectation that if you were injured, the system would try to save you. These were simply the baseline conditions of American military service. He did not understand that to his enemies, these baseline conditions represented abundance so profound it was nearly supernatural. A civilization's excess made manifest in ways that rendered traditional military virtue almost obsolete. And perhaps that was the final victory, the ultimate asymmetry. That Americans could win a war of annihilation without fully understanding how extraordinary their advantages were, could destroy an enemy military culture built on centuries of refinement without recognizing that they were not simply stronger, but different in ways that made traditional comparison meaningless. The damaged Hellcat flew on, repaired, rearmed, refueled, relaunched. Its pilot lived. The system continued. And on a volcanic ridge above black sand beaches that would soon run red with blood from both sides, Japanese officers watched in silence and understood, perhaps for the first time, what kind of enemy they had chosen to awaken. Not warriors, not merchants, something else entirely. A civilization that had learned to make abundance systematic, to make survival probable, to make victory not a transcendent achievement, but an engineering problem to be solved with sufficient steel, aluminium, petroleum, and well-fed pilots who expected to come home. They had fought bravely against this system. They had fought honorably. They had fought according to principles that their culture held sacred. And it had not mattered at all.